In the shadowed corners of history, some stories remain buried until the truth can no longer be ignored. This is the story of a slave whose life was defined not by freedom, but by a duty forced upon her by cruel circumstance. She was tasked with raising the children of the very people who claimed ownership over her. Every meal prepared, every lesson taught, every lullaby sung was a reminder of the stark imbalance of power and the unspoken sacrifices demanded by a system built on oppression. For years, her role was seen as merely a part of household duties, unremarkable and invisible to the wider world. Yet behind the walls of the plantation, a quiet endurance unfolded, one that would later reveal the human cost of slavery in a way that no ledger, no diary, and no historical record could fully capture. The truth of her life, the struggles she endured, and the resilience she demonstrated would eventually come to light, challenging the comfortable narratives of the past and forcing generations to confront the hidden realities of servitude and loss. The life of a slave tasked with raising the children of their master was a reality marked by relentless labor, emotional complexity, and constant invisibility. From the earliest hours of the morning, before the sun had even touched the horizon, she would be awake, preparing the household for the day ahead. Her mornings began with chores that went far beyond the care of the children. She had to ensure that the entire household functioned smoothly, from cleaning the floors and washing the laundry to cooking breakfast and managing the other domestic tasks that kept the plantation running. Every action, no matter how menial it seemed to outsiders, carried an immense weight of responsibility, for any lapse could provoke the wrath of the master or mistress. There was no room for fatigue, no space for complaint, because her labor was expected, demanded, and enforced by the rigid hierarchy that defined her existence. Once the household was in order, her attention shifted entirely to the children. She was responsible for every aspect of their daily lives, from feeding and bathing them to dressing them in clothing she often had to mend or create from worn fabrics. She needed to be constantly vigilant, anticipating their needs before they could articulate them, soothing cries in the dead of night, and managing the delicate balance between discipline and comfort. Yet, she could never allow herself the freedom to show genuine affection in ways that might disrupt the perceived boundaries of her position. Her care was circumscribed by the rules of servitude, and any emotional investment had to be carefully measured, lest it be misinterpreted or punished. She was, in essence, the invisible hand guiding the upbringing of children who would one day inherit the very power that kept her enslaved. Her influence on the children's lives was profound, though it often went unrecognized. She taught them early lessons about the world, guided them in manners and morals, and intervened in moments of danger or conflict. Yet the society in which they lived demanded that she remain unseen and unacknowledged. The children would call her nurse or maid, never mother, and she was never permitted to form the bonds that might have existed had she been free. The intimate knowledge she held of their personalities, their fears, and their desires was a kind of power, but it was power that could never be wielded openly, power that existed only in the private, hidden spaces of the household. She knew the children in ways that even the parents did not, yet her insights were dismissed as mere duty, rather than recognized as intelligence or care. The emotional toll of this role was immense. While she provided comfort and guidance to the children, she could never allow herself the same solace. Her own desires, her own griefs, and her own aspirations were secondary to the needs of the household, and often secondary to the whims of the master and mistress. She lived with a constant, gnawing awareness that she was raising children who would someday occupy a world in which she had no agency, no inheritance, and no recognition. Each lullaby sung was a reminder of her separation from the life she might have had, each scraped knee bandaged, each tear wiped away, a reinforcement of her subjugation. There were no celebrations of her own milestones, no moments of indulgence or personal joy, for her life was entirely consumed by the needs of others. Moreover, she had to navigate a complex landscape of relationships within the household. She interacted with other slaves, some of whom might resent her position because it placed her closer to the family and further from the suffering of manual labor, while others might look to her for guidance or protection, understanding her unique position as both caretaker and subordinate. She had to manage these dynamics delicately, maintaining authority where necessary without overstepping the invisible boundaries imposed by the master. There were constant negotiations of power, influence, and survival, and every decision carried consequences not only for her, but for those under her temporary charge. Her days were physically exhausting, filled with labor that left her body tired and often sore, carrying children, lifting heavy objects, tending to fires, and performing tasks that demanded both strength and dexterity left little time for rest. Nights brought no real reprieve, as infants and young children required care around the clock. Sleep was sporadic and shallow, and her own health was frequently at risk due to the constant demands placed upon her. Illness was a peril not just to her own body but to the household, for as she faltered, the children might go unattended, and the household's smooth operation could be disrupted. There was a relentless pressure to endure, to persevere, to remain vigilant and effective despite exhaustion and pain. Beyond the physical demands, there was a psychological burden that weighed heavily on her. The children were sometimes ungrateful, unaware of the sacrifices she made, or conditioned to view her presence as obligatory rather than nurturing. She witnessed their joys, their triumphs, and their growth while remaining invisible in the narratives of their lives. Any attempt to assert her personhood could be met with punishment, dismissal, or reprimand, and so she learned to hide her emotions, to internalize suffering, and to cultivate a resilience that was at once extraordinary and heartbreaking. Her role required a suppression of self, a constant prioritization of others, and a deep endurance that blurred the lines between care and servitude. At the same time, there were moments of subtle influence and quiet triumph. She shaped the children's character, instilled values that might otherwise have been neglected, and provided a foundation of stability in a world structured around inequity and oppression. Her guidance, though uncredited, impacted who these children would become, their perceptions of kindness, responsibility, and morality. Her presence, while unacknowledged in formal terms, created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate household, influencing family dynamics, social interactions, and perhaps even future decisions made by those who would inherit power and privilege. Despite the immense challenges, she often found ways to assert her dignity within the confines of her role. A gentle word, a carefully hidden act of compassion, or a lesson taught in secret could provide small but meaningful glimpses of agency. These moments, however fleeting, were acts of resilience, demonstrations of her capacity to shape the lives around her even when her own life was constrained. Each day was a balance between subjugation and subtle influence, between obedience and quiet assertion, and navigating this balance demanded an intelligence and fortitude that history too often overlooks. Her life exemplified a profound contradiction. She was both indispensable and invisible, central to the household's functioning yet excluded from the recognition and rewards that her labor warranted. The duality of her existence, nurturer of the master's children while denied autonomy and acknowledgement, illustrates the broader injustices of the system she lived under. It was a role that required constant vigilance, unwavering strength, and the ability to bear the emotional and physical weight of a life defined by others, a life in which her contributions were essential yet erased from the public memory of the household. The depth of her care, her sacrifices, and the complexity of her daily existence reveal not only the inhumanity of slavery, but also the extraordinary resilience of those who endured it. Each day was a testament to survival, adaptability, and the quiet assertion of humanity within a system designed to strip it away. She existed in a space that demanded her to give continuously, to mold, protect, and nurture, while simultaneously erasing the boundaries between her identity and her labor. The nuances of her daily life, the endless cycles of work, the constant negotiation of relationships, and the invisible threads of influence she wove into the children's upbringing paint a portrait of a life both constrained and profoundly impactful, a life whose true significance would only later be understood when the stories long hidden were finally told. Her unwavering dedication, her capacity for endurance, and her hidden influence shaped not only the children she raised, but the legacy of the household itself. The full weight of her role, however, extended far beyond immediate care, encompassing moral, social, and psychological dimensions that were invisible to the eyes of those who benefited from her labor. Each interaction, each lesson, each act of care carried implications that she could never openly claim, yet the subtle effects of her presence would echo through time, influencing those around her in ways that were deeply profound and historically significant. Her story, often unspoken and overlooked, illuminates the realities of slavery in ways that statistics, official records, and historical accounts rarely capture. It exposes the intimate, human cost of a system built on exploitation and underscores the extraordinary resilience of those who, despite extreme subjugation, found ways to nurture, teach, and shape the lives of others while maintaining their own sense of self within impossible constraints. The daily life of a slave raising the master's children was a study in endurance, adaptability, and silent influence, revealing the profound complexities of human labor, emotion, and survival in a world structured around inequity and oppression. The relationships between the children, the slave, and the master's family were complex, layered with tension, dependency, affection, and unspoken hierarchies. From the moment a child was born, the slave assigned to their care became an integral part of their earliest experiences, their first interactions with the world outside the womb. She was present at their cries, their first breaths, their earliest movements, and her hands and voice were often the first sources of comfort they would ever know. Yet, her presence was framed entirely by her lack of freedom and the rigid structures imposed by the master's family. While she cared for these children in ways that were deeply intimate, her role was constantly circumscribed by rules, expectations, and the knowledge that her labor existed to serve the family's interests, not her own. The children themselves occupied a peculiar place within this dynamic. They were simultaneously nurtured and disciplined by someone they could not call their own, someone whose authority was both immense and invisible. They often saw the slave as a caregiver, a protector, a constant presence in the household, yet they were rarely taught to recognize the humanity behind the labor. As infants and young children, they depended on her entirely for survival, for warmth, for education and manners, morals, and even basic knowledge. They learned to trust her instincts and relied on her guidance. Yet this reliance was rarely acknowledged in ways that allowed her to claim a place within the family structure. She was ever present, indispensable, yet invisible, a paradox that shaped every interaction between her and the children. Discipline was a particularly complicated aspect of these relationships. The slave had to enforce rules and boundaries within the household, ensuring that the children obeyed instructions and navigated social expectations as defined by the master and mistress. Yet, she had to do so without overstepping the invisible line that separated servant from authority figure. Any misstep could result in punishment from the master or mistress, leaving her in a constant state of negotiation between caring guidance and imposed compliance. She had to balance firmness with gentleness, teaching lessons in morality, respect, and obedience while also protecting the children from the harshness of the world and the potential cruelty of their own parents. This delicate balancing act required a remarkable intelligence, emotional awareness, and understanding of human behavior, all of which she exercised under the pressure of invisibility and constant scrutiny. The master and mistress themselves contributed to the complexity of these relationships. They viewed the slave primarily as a worker, a tool to fulfill their household needs, yet they often relied on her for tasks that were emotionally intimate and psychologically demanding. They expected her to shape their children into future heirs and social representatives of the family, entrusting her with responsibilities that carried immense moral and social weight. At the same time, they maintained strict boundaries, denying her any acknowledgement or reward beyond the basic survival provisions of food, shelter, and protection from the most extreme forms of punishment. Their dependence on her labor coexisted with their insistence on her subordination, creating a tension that permeated every interaction. The children's perceptions of the slave evolved over time, shaped by both her care and the societal norms surrounding race, servitude, and family hierarchy. As they grew older, some children developed genuine affection and loyalty toward her, recognizing the sacrifices she made and the guidance she provided. Others internalized the social structures that defined her position, seeing her as a figure of authority only insofar as it served the household, or as a background presence whose contributions were unremarkable. These dynamics were further complicated by the contrasting attitudes of the parents, who might encourage obedience and respect toward her while simultaneously denying her acknowledgement or autonomy. The children's understanding of her role was therefore filtered through layers of love, expectation, and societal conditioning, resulting in a relationship that was both deeply personal and profoundly constrained. Moments of conflict and tension were inevitable. The children, in testing boundaries or asserting independence, sometimes resisted the authority of the slave, challenging the limits of her influence. Yet, in these moments, she often demonstrated remarkable patience, finding ways to guide, correct, and teach without resorting to force beyond what was sanctioned by the household. She had to navigate these interactions with care, ensuring that lessons were absorbed without attracting punitive attention from the master or mistress. Her ability to manage these conflicts subtly, shaping behavior while preserving her own safety, underscores the intricate skill required to maintain these relationships in a household defined by power imbalances. At the same time, the slave often had to contend with the emotional burden of observing the children's development while remaining outside the circle of parental affection. She witnessed first words, first steps, first triumphs, and first failures, yet she could never claim credit or recognition. The emotional labor of nurturing, comforting, and guiding children who were biologically unrelated to her, while simultaneously managing her own desires for connection and recognition, created a tension that was both exhausting and psychologically taxing. She lived in a world where her influence was profound but her visibility was minimal, where her labor shaped lives yet her own humanity was frequently denied. The dynamic between the slave and the master's children also extended into moral and ethical territory. She was often in the position of teaching values, instilling principles of honesty, responsibility, and empathy, even as the very system she served violated those same principles. She had to model patience, compassion, and resilience while being denied the freedom to exercise those virtues in her own life. This paradox created a moral complexity that she had to navigate daily, influencing the children's ethical development while contending with the injustice of her own subjugation. Her guidance was both a form of survival and a subtle act of resistance, shaping the next generation in ways that could not be erased even by the inequities of slavery. Relationships with siblings and peers within the household added additional layers of complexity. The slave might have been responsible for multiple children simultaneously, each with unique personalities, needs, and temperaments. She had to manage rivalries, insecurities, and emotional conflicts, ensuring that each child felt attended to while maintaining fairness and authority. In doing so, she developed an acute understanding of human behavior, empathy, and conflict resolution, skills that were essential to the functioning of the household yet rarely acknowledged as valuable. Her role demanded constant attention, emotional intelligence, and adaptability, reinforcing her significance while simultaneously erasing her presence from official recognition. The passage of time did not diminish these dynamics. As children matured into adolescence, the boundaries of authority and influence shifted, requiring the slave to adapt her guidance to changing needs. She became a mentor, confidante, and sometimes mediator, navigating the complex emotional landscapes of growing minds while continuing to operate within the strictures of servitude. The children's awareness of her contributions evolved unevenly. Some recognized her guidance and care with gratitude and respect, while others remained unaware or indifferent, conditioned by the societal hierarchies that separated them. Each interaction reflected a delicate balance of power, affection, and obligation, highlighting the intricate human relationships embedded within the oppressive system of slavery. Ultimately, the relationships between the children, the slave, and the master's family were shaped by a convergence of dependency, authority, affection, and restriction. The children relied on her for their survival and development. The master's family relied on her for the functioning and reputation of the household, and she relied on her skill, intelligence, and resilience to navigate a world that afforded her little recognition or autonomy. Every smile she coaxed, every lesson she imparted, and every conflict she mediated carried weight, shaping personalities, values, and household dynamics in ways that were invisible to formal records yet profoundly significant in human terms. The influence she wielded, though often hidden, extended beyond mere caretaking. She was a silent architect of the children's moral, emotional, and social development, molding their understanding of responsibility, empathy, and human connection. while remaining bound by the limitations imposed on her own life. The relationships she cultivated were a testament to her intelligence, patience, and enduring strength, illustrating how human bonds can flourish even within structures designed to suppress and exploit. Her presence shaped lives in subtle, lasting ways, leaving imprints on the children she raised that could endure far beyond the confines of the household and the constraints of her own circumstances. The truth of the slave's sacrifices and treatment eventually emerged through a combination of personal testimony, historical investigation, and the painstaking reconstruction of records that had long been neglected or deliberately obscured. For decades, her role was invisible to the broader world, her contributions erased from official accounts and dismissed as ordinary domestic labor. Yet the story of her life, her labor, and her resilience persisted in whispers, in family recollections, in fragmented letters, and in the traces of the children she had raised. As historians, genealogists, and descendants began to dig deeper into the past, they uncovered the layers of her existence, revealing the profound impact she had on the household and the subtle yet enduring ways in which her influence shaped lives. The process of uncovering her truth was not simple. It required patience, discernment, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable realities about power, hierarchy, and human exploitation. One of the primary sources that brought her story to light was the oral histories passed down through generations. Formerly enslaved people, their children, and grandchildren often recounted tales of endurance, labor, and moral strength, preserving the memory of those who had been forced to raise others' children while their own lives were circumscribed by oppression. These narratives contain details about her daily routines, the methods she used to manage the children, and the personal sacrifices she made to ensure their survival and well-being. While these accounts were sometimes fragmentary or tinged with the distortions of memory, when cross-referenced with other documents, they painted a vivid picture of a life defined by service, endurance, and moral fortitude. They revealed not only the physical demands of her labor but the emotional and psychological resilience she demonstrated in the face of relentless constraints. Written records also contributed significantly to the emergence of the truth. Household ledgers, letters, and diaries from the master's family occasionally contained references to her work, often couched in language that minimized her role or treated it as a routine duty. Yet, when examined carefully, these documents offered crucial insights into the scope and intensity of her labor. Records of daily schedules, payments for other domestic workers, and notes on child-rearing responsibilities revealed the degree to which she managed the household's youngest members and maintained its functioning. Even when the entries were brief or dismissive, they provided a framework through which historians could reconstruct the depth of her contributions and the inequities she endured. These records, when read with an understanding of the broader social context, highlighted the extraordinary demands placed upon her and the systematic erasure of her agency and identity. The children themselves, later adults, sometimes became inadvertent witnesses to her story. As they grew and reflected on their upbringing, some acknowledged the profound role she had played in their lives, recounting memories of care, guidance, and protection. These reflections offered intimate glimpses into the human dimension of her labor, revealing the emotional bonds she had formed and the subtle ways she had shaped their development. However, these acknowledgments were often complicated by the societal structures that had defined her role. Children, conditioned by privilege and hierarchy, sometimes struggled to fully recognize the inequities of her position, even while appreciating her care. Their recollections were a mix of gratitude, dependency, and partial understanding, offering a nuanced perspective on how her labor was experienced by those she raised, and highlighting the challenges of reconciling personal affection with systemic injustice. Archaeological and material evidence also played a role in uncovering her story. Items she may have used in child-rearing, clothing she mended, or household spaces she occupied can offer tangible connections to her daily life. Such artifacts, while silent, provide context and dimension to the narratives preserved in oral and written form. The careful study of these objects, in conjunction with historical records, allows researchers to imagine the physical and emotional landscape she navigated, emphasizing the relentlessness of her work and the skill, knowledge, and care required to fulfill her duties. Even the architecture of the household, Spaces designated for domestic labor, childcare, and restricted movement reflects the structural inequalities that shaped her existence, making the built environment itself a witness to her life. The broader societal context also helps illuminate the significance of her experiences. Understanding the legal, economic, and cultural frameworks of slavery allows historians and readers to grasp the magnitude of her constraints and the courage required to endure them. Slavery was a system designed to strip individuals of autonomy, deny them recognition, and commodify their labor. Within this system, her role as a caretaker of the master's children carried a dual weight. She was indispensable to the household yet denied acknowledgement, intimately connected to the family's emotional life, yet perpetually marginalized. By situating her story within these structures, the emerging truth underscores the systemic injustices that defined her existence and the extraordinary resilience she displayed in navigating them. Memoirs and autobiographies of formerly enslaved people, often written decades after emancipation, further contributed to the emergence of her truth. These narratives frequently recounted similar experiences of raising others' children, providing corroborative context and comparative insights. While her own voice may have been absent from written records, these collective experiences help reconstruct the psychological and emotional landscape of her labor. They reveal patterns of care, sacrifice, endurance, and moral courage, highlighting not only the physical and emotional demands placed on enslaved caretakers, but the ethical dilemmas they faced in balancing obedience with compassion, authority with empathy, and survival with moral integrity. The emergence of her story also prompted reconsideration of historical narratives that had previously minimized or ignored the contributions of enslaved women in domestic and familial roles. Scholars recognized that the upbringing of children, management of households, and transmission of values were acts of immense significance, often performed under extreme constraint and with little acknowledgement. By documenting and analyzing her experiences, historians challenged simplistic portrayals of slavery that focused exclusively on field labor or overt brutality, highlighting the nuanced and deeply human dimensions of oppression. This broader perspective allows for a fuller understanding of the moral and social stakes involved in her life, and the ways in which her labor, though hidden, shaped both her immediate environment and subsequent generations. The process of uncovering her truth was not without difficulty. Many records had been lost, destroyed, or deliberately obscured, while surviving accounts often reflected the biases of those in positions of power. Researchers had to approach the evidence with care, reading between the lines, interpreting silences, and piecing together fragmentary information to reconstruct a coherent narrative. Each discovery, however small, contributed to a growing recognition of her role and significance, transforming what had once been invisible labor into a documented testament to endurance, intelligence, and moral strength. This painstaking work underscores the importance of historical rigor and empathy in bringing hidden lives into the light. As her story came to light, it prompted both reflection and reevaluation among descendants, scholars, and the public. People began to understand the scale of her contributions, the depth of her sacrifices, and the emotional and moral labor that accompanied her role. This recognition not only honored her memory but also illuminated broader truths about the experiences of enslaved women, the dynamics of power within households, and the human costs of systemic oppression. By centering her narrative, historians and storytellers could challenge assumptions, confront uncomfortable realities, and ensure that her life was no longer invisible. The documentation and dissemination of her story also created a space for contemporary engagement with historical injustices. It invites readers and audiences to grapple with the lived experiences of those subjected to systemic oppression, to acknowledge the complexity of human relationships under slavery, and to appreciate the resilience and moral courage of individuals whose contributions were long ignored. The emergence of her truth thus serves not only as a historical revelation, but as a catalyst for understanding, empathy, and reflection on the ways in which societies remember, value, and honor human labor and human dignity. Ultimately, the uncovering of her story represents the triumph of memory, persistence, and historical inquiry over erasure, allowing her life, her sacrifices, and her resilience to be recognized and appreciated in a way that had been denied during her lifetime. The truth of her experience challenges simplified narratives of slavery, highlighting the intimate, moral, and emotional dimensions of her labor and ensuring that the general, her story, once hidden in the shadows of history, now stands as a testament to the resilience, intelligence, and humanity of those who endured unimaginable burdens. She was more than a caretaker. She was a teacher, a protector, a moral compass, and an unseen architect of lives that would carry her influence far beyond the walls of the plantation. By finally acknowledging her sacrifices and the truth of her labor, we confront the realities of oppression, the depth of human endurance, and the courage it takes to survive and nurture under injustice. Her life reminds us that even in systems designed to erase humanity, strength, dignity, and love can persist, leaving a legacy that demands recognition, reflection, and remembrance. History may have tried to silence her, but her story now speaks louder than ever, compelling us to honor those whose lives were lived in service, yet whose spirits remain unbroken.